You know, you hear very frequently people say things like everyone's creative.
It's hard to monetize your creativity. Artists have a hell of a time surviving. So creativity as such is a double-edged blessing.
Creativity seems to be associated with, then again depends on whether or not, on how you define creativity. Or if you take people who are noted for their creativity, there's a high probability that they'll have a higher IQ. But there's more to it than IQ. And what creativity seems to be associated with, then again depends on whether or not, on how you define creativity. Because you could define it as the sum total of creative achievements that you've made in your life, which would be the actual production of, say, artifacts of one form or another, performances or inventions or artworks, or you could also define it as the proclivity to engage in creative thought. So what does it mean to think creatively? It's something like this. You imagine that I tossed you out an idea, and there's some probability that when I toss you that idea, that will trigger off other ideas in your imagination. So you could think about it as a threshold issue. If you're not very creative, I'll throw you an idea and hardly any other ideas will be triggered, and the ones that will be triggered are going to be very closely associated with that initial idea. So let's say I tossed each of you an idea and I asked you to tell me the first thing that comes to mind. The first thing that comes to mind in all likelihood would be shared by many of you. Okay, so then you could think about that as a common response, right? And so that's a less creative response. And then there'll be some things that come to mind for you that are so idiosyncratic that you're the only person that thinks it and no one can understand it. Well, that's also not exactly creative, because for something to be creative, it has to be novel and useful at the same time. That's sort of a rough definition. Something creative is novel and useful. And obviously, there's a certain amount of judgment that goes along with that, clearly. But if it's too novel, then no one else can understand it, and it's unlikely to be useful. So there's a range of convenience. So anyways, if you want to decide if something's creative, I could say to you, okay, in the next 3 minutes, I want you to write down all the uses you can think of for a brick. So if we gathered your responses, say I said you have to think up 20 things that you could do with a brick, then a bunch of the things that you thought would be the same, and some people would come up with something different. So anyway, so you'll get a graph of probability of response, right? And the more probable, the less creative, roughly speaking. It's not the only criteria though, because you also have to look at utility. The first thing I would do is just figure out how many uses you generated. That's called fluency. And we could also do that. I could just say, write down as many words as you can that begin with the letter S in 3 minutes, or that begin with the letter C, or 4-letter words that begin with the letter D. You know, I can constrain it. And if I counted how many words you generated, if I had an IQ measure and I had a measure of how many words you generated, IQ plus the number of words that you generated would be a better predictor of your creativity than just IQ. So there's this fluency element and so that's something like the rate at which you can produce, say, verbal ideas. And one of the things we do know about the creativity dimension of openness is that it is associated with fluency. And it's also associated with originality. And originality would be how improbable your use was compared to the uses generated by other people. So you can think of, you get thrown an idea and there's some probability that will co-activate other ideas. And if it co-activates many other ideas, that's like fluency. And if it co-activates ideas that are quite distant from the original idea, something like that, and you could track distance by comparing it to probability that other people have generated it, then that's also another indication of creativity. So they have to be many unlikely responses that are useful. That's what creativity is, roughly speaking. And then you can fractionate it into different dimensions. So that's creative thinking. But then creative achievement would be the ability to take those original ideas and then actually to implement them in the world. And that's obviously much more different than merely being creative. And then what creativity is depends on which of those measurement routes that you take. You know, you hear very frequently people say things like everyone's creative. It's like, that's wrong. Okay? It's wrong. It's just as wrong as saying that everyone's extroverted. First of all, you have to be pretty damn smart to be creative, because otherwise you're just going to get to where other people have already got, and that's not creative by definition. So being fast and being out there at the front of things really makes a difference. And then you also have to have these divergent thinking capabilities, and that's part of your trait structure. And creative people are really different than non-creative people. You know, partly because, for example, they're highly motivated to do creative things and to experience novelty and to and to chase down aesthetic experiences, and to attend movies, and to read fiction, and to go to museums, and to enjoy poetry, and to enjoy music that's not conventional music, for example. These aren't trivial differences. And so it's a real misstatement to make the proposition that everyone's creative. It's just simply not the case. It's a matter of wishful thinking. It's like saying that everyone's intelligent. It's like, well, if everyone's intelligent, then the term loses all of its meaning. Because any term that you can apply to every member of a category has absolutely no meaning. And you know, the other thing you want to be thinking about here is that don't be thinking that creativity is such a good thing. It's a high risk, high return strategy. So if you're creative, you just try this. There's creative people in this room, man. You guys are going to have a hell of a time monetizing your creativity. It's virtually impossible. It's really, really difficult because, first of all, let's say you make an original product. You think the world will beat a pathway to your door if you build a better mousetrap. It's like, that's complete rubbish. It isn't true in the least. If you make a good creative product, you've probably solved about 5% of your problem. Because then you have marketing, which is insanely difficult, and then you have sales, and then you have customer support, and then you have to build an organization, and you have to, if it's really novel, you have to tell people what the hell the thing is. You know, we built this future authoring program, right, and it's available for people online. So how do you market that? No one knows what that is, and that's a real problem. If you write a book, well, then you have the problem that another million people have also written a book. But if you produce something that's completely new and doesn't have a category, people can't search for it online. How are they going to find it? And then you have pricing problems, and it's really unbelievably difficult to produce something creative and then monetize it. So the overwhelming probability is that you will fail, but a small proportion of creative people succeed spectacularly. And so it's like a lottery in some sense. You're probably going to lose. But if you don't lose, you could win big. And that keeps a lot of creative people going. If you happen to be creative, if you're a songwriter or another kind of musician or an artist or any of the other number of things that you might be, find a way to make money and then practice your craft on the side, because you will starve to death otherwise. Now, for some of you that won't be true, but it's a tiny minority. Your best bet is to find a job that will keep body and soul together and parse off some time that you can pursue your creative thing, because then, well, as a long-term strategy, medium to long-term strategy, it's a better one. But it's got incredibly difficult for people, musicians for example, it's incredibly difficult for new musicians to monetize their craft, even if they're really, really good at it. So I say, well, everyone's not creative, and everybody goes, oh, that's terrible. It's like, it's not so terrible. It's not self-evident that you would curse someone with high levels of creativity. You could say that all people are creative and that all people can generate ideas, but the issue isn't whether or not you can generate ideas, it's whether or not you can generate ideas that are different from the ideas that other people generate. That's the critical issue. Because, I mean, it depends on how you define it. Well, the novelty is a huge part of it, but that's sort of built into the definition of creative. It has to be novel and useful. And if your idea that you generate is the same as the idea that a bunch of other people have, it's not. It's an idea, fair enough. And if you define creativity that way, then everyone's creative. But it's a foolish way of defining creativity because everyone does it.